Thank you very much. I just have a few brief comments. Today's event was made possible through the very generous funding from the European Union's Erasmus Plus program. And more specifically, it's an outcome of the fact that Dr. Andrea Wagner over here was awarded and appointed to a Jean Monnet Chair, which is a teaching post funded by the Erasmus Plus program to scholars with a specialization in EU studies. And so to this point, I want to congratulate Dr. Wagner for this accomplishment, and I want to thank her for her tireless work to make it a reality. The application process for this program is difficult, not simply because the competition is strong, but also because of the numerous administrative requirements that it has. And as the first applicant for MacEwan University, Dr. Wagner really had to initiate and navigate this process from scratch. And so beyond developing an excellent proposal, focusing on supporting research and teaching on the future of a post-Brexit EU, the topic of our discussions today, it was largely through the passion and the force of will of Dr. Wagner, along with some incredible support from our provost, Dr. Craig Monk, MacEwan, the team at MacEwan International, sure, Andrea really wants to applaud all of these because there was, I'm going off script here, there was a lot of midnight emails from Andrea just because she was so enthusiastic about this that everyone was getting done and everyone responded. So MacEwan Research was another one that was extremely supportive. And the Dean's Office from the Faculty of Arts and Science, Dr. Malika Shalmalan and Dr. Ed Lorkovic, who both at various stages supported this application. So thank you very much to all of those members of MacEwan. In 2019, there were 1,290 applications for this program, out of only which 285 were selected for funding. From this, Dr. Wagner received approximately 45,000 euros, which will allow her to update and expand course offerings in our department, one in EU politics, another in EU economics, as well as to organize and support events such as this one, which, as you can see, is bringing together scholars from several institutions, journalists, political strategists, government officials, students, and members of the wider community. And it's exactly this kind of event that fulfills MacEwan's mandate to be a student and community-engaged university. So on behalf of the Department of Anthropology, Economics, and Political Science and MacEwan University more generally, I again welcome you and I thank you all very much for participating in today's event.
Is this okay? How do I? Lucas, I need some help, I think. Is this okay? Yes. All right. Well, first of all, thank you for coming to this event. I have been advertising it now for 2 weeks, and I forced all my students to come because I said that whatever we're going to discuss will be in the midterm and final exam. So please take notes, even if you're not taking my courses. There was food, and it's past tense, I think. There's still some leftover, which we're going to eat after the event is over. So I would first like to introduce Dr. Achim Hurrelmann. I have known Dr. Hurrelmann now for over 10 years. He was one of my supervisors during my PhD years at Carleton University. And I must tell you that I thank him for all the success I have achieved because his support was invaluable in providing me with guidance, hope, confidence, mentoring, and everything you would need as a PhD student to become successful and land an academic job. So I'm very, very thankful that he's here. I'm also very thankful that all panelists who are here have agreed to have an interesting conversation on Brexit. So here I would like to again thank Dr. Jared Wesley, Dr. Laurie Tarlaxon, Dr. Brandon Boyd, Najib Judd, Dr. John Sorosky, Graham as well, of course, for agreeing to this panel. And I hope we will have a very interesting conversation about Brexit and what we can learn about successionism. Is successionism a highly controversial issue? What are the costs of successionism? Should we be a little bit more careful when it comes to Brexit and Western alienation? And what can we learn from Brexit? In order to understand Brexit, Dr. Achim Hurrelmann is going to have a wonderful presentation in which he's going to talk about why Brexit matters for Canada. I would like to also let you know that Dr. Achim Hurrelmann is an associate professor of political science at Carleton University. He is the co-director of the Center of European Studies, and he's also a professor at the Institute, at the Political Science Department at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Achim's scholarly work focuses on the politics of the European Union. He's particularly interested in political discourse about European integration, democracy and legitimacy, as well as Canada-Europe relations. He has received a very prestigious grant from Scheer in 2019, which will allow him in the next 5 years to research the European Union governance and policy making in the context of Brexit and how Brexit is discussed in Canada. His research articles have appeared in some of the leading journals in the field, including European Journal of Political Research, West European Politics, and Journal of European Public Policy. And I also have to add that on Monday, we finally managed to publish together a paper in comparative European politics, and it only took us 4 years. So we were very, very happy, and we're going to, celebrate that tonight. As I already mentioned, in addition to Dr. Hurrelmann having been awarded a number of research grants, the most important one that stands out is the recent one, which is titled The Reconfiguration of Canada-Europe Relations After Brexit. He will speak about the preliminary findings of that grant today. In addition to being fantastic and excellent when it comes to research, Dr. Hurrelmann has also received a teaching award in 2011, and he has taught introductory courses in the field of political science and European, Russian, and Eurasian studies. If you are interested to go to EURUS and start graduate school in European studies, I welcome all my students to have conversations with Dr. Hurrelmann after the event. So let's start. Dr. Achim Hurrelmann.
Okay, so can you hear me? I asked for a different microphone so that I can walk around a little bit. So first of all, congratulations, Andrea, on this great achievement of the Jean Monnet Chair. It's no small feat, particularly if you're the first at your university to be awarded this very prestigious chair, which indicates that she is one of the top experts in the world in studying the European Union. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here for this event in the honor of a longtime collaborator, a friend, and certainly one of the stars of EU studies in Canada. So congratulations. I also want to start very briefly. I had to think back to the event that inaugurated my own Jean Monnet Chair a couple of years ago. I had recruited a very prominent guest speaker, Vivian Schmidt. Some of you might have heard her name. She had announced a talk on how the EU's legitimacy is affected by the Eurozone crisis. Being in Ottawa, I had asked the ambassador of the European Union to give some 5-minute opening remarks. But the ambassador of the EU was so upset by the title, questioning the EU's legitimacy in the crisis, that she turned her opening remarks into a 25-minute lecture why the EU was not in crisis, which totally threw off the whole event. So wise decision. The current charge d'affaires of the EU would never do this, but a wise decision to not have any more greetings. And I should probably also start now with the material of my presentation. So, as was mentioned, this talk draws on a collaborative project, which is not myself alone, but a project that has been funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and that also includes some excellent colleagues, Frédéric Meron from Université de Montréal, Patrick Leblanc from the University of Ottawa, and Petra Dolata from the University of Calgary, where we want to look at the impact of Brexit on Canada. And if you ask me today what will the impact be, I can only tell you I can't say this is exactly what we want to research. It's not clear at this point. The objective of this project is to follow along over a 4 to 5 year period how both the political relations between Canada and Europe, the UK, the EU, its member states, will be reconfigured by Brexit, but also what type of internal discourses Brexit will trigger within Canada. And I will present on this, but mainly to lay out the main claim that we should pay attention to Brexit in Canada. There has been so far a tendency to just sort of lean back and watch this never-ending saga as observers, and we couldn't do much more until now. But now that Brexit is actually happening at the end of this month, it's high time to realize that it will have some very important implications for Canada. And I'll try to lay out some of them, and I look forward to your questions. I can get into more detail on particular issues, or maybe I can't, then I will tell you. So here's the structure of my presentation. I want to very briefly take stock of where we are in the Brexit process to just make sure that everyone understands what has happened, what has not happened on Brexit. And then I want to talk about the impacts on Canada with sort of two focal points. First, focusing more on policy, how Brexit poses a challenge to economic and political relations between Canada and its European partners. And secondly, and that might take actually more of the first point, I want to talk about how Brexit might lead to reconsiderations of Canada's identity as a global actor. And I will draw for this on one of the first results that we have from this research, namely a survey that we had conducted of Canadians on their views of Brexit and the future of Canada-Europe relation, where we'll present some of the first findings. So, where are we with Brexit? The referendum on Brexit took place June 23rd, 2016. Briefly, to talk about the context, the United Kingdom is not one of the original member states of the European communities that were created in the 1950s, but was one of the first countries to join. The first enlargement of the European communities happened in 1973, when the UK came in along with Ireland and Denmark, and actually there was a first referendum on continued membership of the United Kingdom in the European communities 2 years later in 1975, which resulted in approximately a two-thirds majority in favor of remaining in the European communities that they had only just joined. But the debate about whether the UK should be in the European Union did not really go away, and it did actually intensify towards the end of Margaret Thatcher's realms, lingered around in the 1990s, 2010s, and then came to a head in 2015 when Prime Minister David Cameron promised, going into an election campaign, that if he was re-elected, he would hold an in-out referendum, as it was then called, on whether Britain should stay in the UK, in the EU. Cameron himself indicating that he would want to campaign for Remain, which he did, but lost, as you know, in a campaign that focused largely on the Remain side, on the economic benefits of being in the EU, and on the Leave side on issues of sovereignty, democracy, and also heavily intra-EU migration. The EU likes to call this mobility if it's internal to the EU and not migration. So the issue is people from other EU member states having the right to move freely to any member states, including the United Kingdom. And you see here at the bottom, unless the chairs are blocking that, the result, 52% voting for Leave, 48% Remain, at a very healthy turnout of 72%. And you also see that there were some sort of regional differences in how the various regions of the UK voted. I won't get into that in more detail, but if you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. There has now been some very good research done on the factors that explain people's vote choice. And here, just drawing on a piece by Sarah Hobolt on where she tries, based on a large-scale survey, to identify which types of voters were more likely to vote for Brexit and which ones were more likely to vote against it. She identified these four factors: age, turned out to be relevant, and if it says plus here, then that means the older, the more likely you are to vote for Brexit, and minus means the opposite. So male people were more likely to vote for Brexit than females, highly educated, less likely to vote for Brexit, people with high income, less likely, and so on. You see various other factors here discussed as well in terms of identity. English identity had the strongest effect for motivating people to vote for Brexit. British identity somewhat less. Unsurprisingly, if people felt a European identity, they were against Brexit. She identifies factors of party politics, both sort of general mistrust in politicians, which had a strong effect in her regressions, but also significant differences between political parties, with particularly the Conservative Party and the UK Independence Party, UKIP. Obviously, their supporters were in favor of Brexit, whereas in this research, Labour and the Scottish National Party or the Welsh Regional Party were more likely to vote against Brexit. And the last group of factors that she examines are policy attitudes, where she tests sort of a number of statements and their influence. Most of them are somewhat unsurprising because, yes, of course, if you think that the EU has been bad for the UK, you might obviously be more inclined to vote to leave. But this is also what she finds in this research. I bring this up here because I will later use some of the same categories to try to make sense of the Canadian public opinion on Brexit. Where are we now with the Brexit negotiations? Well, we have completed a first stage, an important milestone. We almost have completed, I should say, because the UK is still a member of the European Union until January 31st. And as far as I know, the European Parliament has not yet passed the withdrawal agreement, but that should be a routine vote. So what has been concluded right now and will soon come into effect are two documents. One is called the Withdrawal Agreement, and the second is the so-called Political Declaration. The Withdrawal Agreement talks about these four issues that are listed here. Financial settlement, meaning that it decides or sort of calculates what type of money the UK still owes the European Union for programs that have already begun or are still ongoing. Citizens' rights refers to the citizens of EU countries who reside in the United Kingdom, under which conditions can they stay, what kind of processes do they have to go through to get authorization, and vice versa, British people in the remaining member states of the European Union. Because remember, in the EU, there is this free movement provision that people can move to other member states without any explicit authorization. That would obviously come to an end with Brexit, but many people have taken advantage of it, and both sides agreed that they shouldn't just be kicked out. The question of the Irish border proved probably the most controversial issue of all here in the withdrawal agreement, and that is the question about how to ensure that between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, which is an independent member state, there would not have to be a physical border with infrastructure and border checks and customs controls and so on. And the last point, this withdrawal agreement puts in place a transition period until the end of this year, 2020, in which the UK will no longer be a member state of the EU, but it will still be in the EU single market and customs union. So all of the important economic effects of Brexit will not actually come into effect until January 1st of next year. And this transition period is supposed to give the parties time to negotiate their future relationship. Not very much time. Many people have remarked that the time might not be sufficient, but that is the initial idea. The second part of this stage one negotiation was the political declaration. This is a much shorter and sort of more visionary, less legally binding document that talks about how this future relationship should look like, how the parties want the future relationship to look like. But the details of that still remain to be negotiated. This was all negotiated under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union, and if you have followed this process, you might remember that there was a first version of the Withdrawal Agreement negotiated under the Prime Ministership of Theresa May, which she failed to get through the British Parliament 3 times. The dates are listed here, mainly over concerns of the solution that had been found for the Irish border, the so-called backstop, which would have said, we avoid a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland unless we find any better solution by keeping the entirety of the United Kingdom in, at least temporarily, a common customs territory with the European Union. So essentially tying the United Kingdom very closely to the European Union for a potentially indefinite period until a better solution is found. This was not popular, largely explains why the agreement was rejected 3 times. Boris Johnson came in as Prime Minister, chose a different solution, which will require intra-United Kingdom customs checks between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, and this will now enable, according to this new solution, that there does not need to be any customs controls on the Irish island between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. What is important is that Johnson's deal does not have a backstop, but that does not only mean that it has a different solution for solving the issue of the Irish border, it also means that if at the end of the transition period no solution has been found, then we have still a no-deal scenario. So a no-deal Brexit is not off the table. The only thing that has been resolved now is the situation in Ireland. Theresa May's backstop would have been a safety mechanism that goes well beyond that. That would have said if no solution is found, then there's a safety mechanism that kicks in. Will not be the case here, which means that stage 2 of the negotiations, which is still to come and will have to begin imminently because of the tight deadlines, will be very important. The agreement on a new economic and political partnership between the UK and the European Union, to be negotiated as far as that is possible by the end of this year. And it will have to be negotiated under a different treaty provision, Article 207 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which gives individual member states of the EU more power to block an agreement. So it's going to be more difficult to get the EU to agree on such an agreement than under Article 50, which was used so far. So that just to say Brexit is not done. Stage 1 of the negotiations is done, but a lot is still happening, will still be happening. The no-deal scenario, which many people consider the worst case outcome, is still possible on January 1st, 2021. And it will be the job of the European and British negotiators to prevent that as far as they can. So anyways, that is where we are at. And anyway, I just wanted to emphasize it would be a misconception to say that this is now over. Then let's bring Canada in. So focusing first on policy, trade, and political relations with Europe. So how do they look like? Canada has very close and very good economic and political relations with Europe. Economically, they are currently structured by the CETA agreement, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union, which gives Canadian businesses and consumers preferential access to the single market and which applies to all of the EU's member states. Politically, there is an equivalent of this agreement, which is called Strategic Partnership Agreement for non-economic relations. It mainly sets out an infrastructure for a whole series of meetings that are going on a day-to-day basis on all kinds of policy issues where Europeans and Canadians think it might be useful to cooperate. So the status quo is quite positive and perceived as such by both parties. But both politically and economically, the UK, I would say quite clearly, has been Canada's strongest partner in Europe. Economically, I will show you some figures in a moment. Around 30 to 40% of trade with the EU are actually with the UK. And politically, Canada has always, very, very frequently found that it shares the views of the United Kingdom to a much greater extent to those than other European member states. And often in negotiations with the EU, Canada has tried to forge a particularly close relationship with the UK, also sort of as a conduit to the EU institutions, because the UK was seen as a particular strong friend and like-minded partner. So obviously, I'm sure our politicians have discussed this challenge quite seriously, haven't they? Well, this is a typical discussion on Brexit, which we found in the Canadian House of Commons about a year ago. Actually, it wasn't even about Brexit, but you'll see how it comes up. Andrew Scheer asking Justin Trudeau, why did the Prime Minister wait so long to fire his ambassador to China? Trudeau saying, we will take no lessons from the leader of the opposition, whose only pronouncement on foreign policy has been to come down on one side of Brexit, the most divisive debate to happen in the UK for an awfully long time. Scheer couldn't resist saying the Prime Minister came down on the losing side of that debate in the United Kingdom, to which Trudeau said the member opposite just did it again. He came down clearly on one side of the most divisive debate in the UK in a long time. You want more examples from the election campaign? Justin Trudeau tweeting, Andrew Scheer is bringing far-right American-style politics to Canada, focusing on the fact that Scheer has been an advocate of Brexit. And yes, he has, he still is. Andrew Scheer, Brexit is still cool. That was just in December when it had happened. This is not, in my position, the debate that Canada needs to have about Brexit, because we have really serious policy challenges that emerge from Brexit. And I promised you some economic figures here. So this table lists Canadian foreign trade, exports and imports and merchandise services and foreign direct investment. And I put this red box around the EU and then the UK as obviously still part of the EU as we speak. And you see that, particularly if you look at the exports, in each category, it's 35 to 40% of Canadian merchandise exports to the EU actually go to the UK. A little less for service exports, but also substantial investment. Well, it's a little lower, but also the UK is by far the most important economic partner of Canada in the European Union. That is not to say that all of the goods, say, that are shipped to the United Kingdom necessarily remain in the UK. They might be sent on to other member states, and it's very difficult to actually know to what extent that occurs, because there are no internal customs borders in the European Union. But it's very clear that Canada trades heavily with the United Kingdom, more so than with other EU member states, even larger economies like Germany and France. So a big challenge after Brexit will be to reconfigure trade relations after Brexit. And that has two dimensions. The first dimension is trade between Canada and the United Kingdom. Because after Brexit, and to be more precise, after the end of the transition period, end of this year, the CETA agreement will no longer cover trade between Canada and the United Kingdom. So there is a need to replace it with a new bilateral agreement between Canada and the UK, which will need to be negotiated in this short time window, where obviously UK trade negotiators have a lot of other things to do as well. They are also negotiating with the EU. They hope to be negotiating with the United States. The UK is completely rebuilding its trade policy from scratch. Canada is just one player in this context, but it will have to be making its voice heard, because it's an important thing for Canada to continue to have these preferential trade relationships. Now, obviously, the CETA agreement is a useful template for that. Many aspects can just be cut and paste from CETA. That's nice. But there's still some challenges for the negotiators. One of the biggest challenges is that the broader context of UK trade policy is totally unclear to Canadians. Normally, when Canada negotiates a trade agreement with another partner, they know all of that partner's other trade agreements, and and they know sort of where Canada could come in and which types of concessions it could ask by offering perhaps certain concessions back home. In the case of the United Kingdom after Brexit, we do not have this information. And in fact, Canada and the UK were apparently a year ago inching in on sort of a pre-agreement, and then Canadian negotiators pulled the plug because some British negotiators suggested that it could be possible after Brexit that the UK just generally lowers all of its tariffs to zero or to an extremely low figure, which would mean that all the concessions that Canada has made are without concessions given to everyone else, which obviously for Canada then doesn't make sense to make any concessions. So you need to know the broader context of trade negotiations. And the biggest challenge here in the case of the post-Brexit negotiations is that everything in the UK changes, so Canada doesn't really know where it will come in. That's a challenge which obviously experts in Global Affairs Canada have to work through. But then there's also the challenge of Canada-EU trade, because I mentioned a lot of the goods that are shipped to the UK from Canada might not stay in the UK, they might be sent on to other member states. And there's also been a lot of investment from Canada in the UK, but many of the companies that invested in the UK might have done that in order to serve the entire European single market, not just the UK. So these companies are very dependent on how the future relationship between the UK and the EU will be structured. Canada has no formal stake in that, so we can really just watch. We don't have any leverage. We can just hope that the European Union and the United Kingdom sort out this issue to move to a continuation of smooth trade relations also for these Canadian companies. Politically, I would argue that the situation looks a little bit better and the challenges are more manageable. In terms of Canada-UK relations, it's important to understand that the Strategic Partnership Agreement is not like the CETA agreement, sort of an all-encompassing document that manages the entirety of political relations between Canada and the United Kingdom. There have been lots of other forums in which Canada and the United Kingdom have cooperated bilaterally, multilaterally. NATO is just one example for multilateral relations, and all of that will continue and will not be affected by Brexit necessarily any great deal. There could even be, and that is the last point here, I talked to a neighbor over the holidays who works in the public service and remarked that there could be benefits for Canada because the UK can take a more independent role in some multilateral settings, taking a position that is closer to Canada's as opposed to having to toe the line with the European Union. But in relations between Canada and the European Union, Canada will lose this preferred intermediary in the United Kingdom where they often went to when a particularly contentious issue needed to be discussed and where Canada often relied on sort of like-mindedness and same perceptions of major political issues. So these are challenges, but I would judge them as being somewhat less immediately pressing than the economic challenges of finding a replacement for the CETA agreement. And then the second key element, which I think we should think about, and that is reconsidering or considering the effects of Brexit on Canada's identity as a global actor. And here's some considerations about that. When the United Kingdom first joined the European communities, as they were then called, Canada didn't like that at all. That was under the Diefenbaker government when that was first discussed. And Canada felt quite rightly that the UK joining the European communities would devalue the Commonwealth and its preference scheme. But over time, Canada has forged a really close relationship with what is now the European Union, which I would argue is perhaps more important even symbolically than materially. Materially, you looked at the trade figures. The United States obviously dominates everything for Canada. The European Union is not anywhere close to that. But symbolically, it has been quite important for Canada to have good relations with the European Union, in part because this has facilitated a very useful synergy between different views of Canada as a global actor. People who see Canada as part of an Anglosphere of countries didn't have anything to object with relations to the EU as long as the United Kingdom was part of the European Union. People in Quebec or other French Canadians who see Canada as part of a Francosphere, as Justin Marcy has put it, could also be happy with that because France obviously is a member of the European Union as well. People who see Canada's role primarily as promoting internationalism, international law, global institutions, they love the European Union because it is an example of global institution building. And people who think the most important thing for Canadian foreign policy is to become less dependent on the US and counterbalance that influence, they have also often looked to the European Union as providing this counterbalance. So we really have a synergy. Relations with the European Union were uncontroversial, and really everyone found something to like about them. But this need not continue to be the case after Brexit, as we have already seen. These debates about what is Canada's global identity could be reignited. And I just want to focus here again on Justin Trudeau and Andrew Scheer because they have quite nicely, I think, represented the various positions that can be taken in this context. Trudeau is here speaking in front of the European Parliament in 2017, emphasizing in very strong words the close relations that Canada has with the European Union, historic partnership on all kinds of things. Indeed, the Canada-EU relationship has become an exemplary demonstration of international collaboration. So he's clearly very favorable of the relationship with the European Union, importantly, not just on trade issues, but also on broader political issues. And he has been somewhat more skeptical of the United Kingdom post-Brexit when he visited Ireland in 2017. You can see him here with the Irish Prime Minister. There was this remark in a press conference: there are tremendous opportunities for countries like Canada and Ireland at a time where perhaps our significant allies and trading partners, in the case of the UK and the US, are turning inward, or at least turning in a different direction, to make the pitch that Canada and Ireland are places that are exciting and open to the world in a positive, progressive way. Now, I'm not saying that Trudeau doesn't want Canada to have relations with the United Kingdom. Of course he does. But it seems in these statements that there's an emphasis on relationships with the European Union as sort of the more important partnership, where there's the more sort of a stronger commitment and a stronger sense of commonality. And we find the exact opposite even more clearly pronounced in Andrew Scheer's comments on Brexit. He wrote an op-ed in the National Post shortly before the referendum on June 20th, in which he drew the linkage between British political traditions and Canada's political traditions, saying local decisions by local representatives, that's what we inherited from Britain, and he felt that the EU is destroying that in the United Kingdom. The supremacy of Parliament is increasingly being replaced by the dictates of EU bureaucrats in Brussels. A stronger, more independent and economically dynamic United Kingdom would not only be good for the country itself, it would also be good for Canada and the entire world. So here we see sort of an attempt to place Canada sort of more in this Anglosphere of countries, and a very different vision of how Canada would behave internationally. Again, I'm not saying that Scheer would say scrap all relations with the European Union, but he doesn't have much positive things to say about the European Union. It is clearly a much closer relationship that is being envisaged here with the United Kingdom. So that triggered us to ask, if there's this debate emerging, what would Canadians think about that? And this is the motivation for commissioning this public opinion survey last fall, which was conducted in late September of last year by a polling company, Nanos Research, who did that for us, asking our questions. And I will present to you some findings from that public opinion research to see to what extent these debates that we see here at the political level are actually resonating in the population. And the first finding that might be striking is that when asked whether people have sympathy with Brexit, very fewer, I must admit, than I had thought, fewer people say that they have sympathy with Brexit. Only about 23% say that they feel either sympathetic or somewhat sympathetic towards Brexit, while a much larger group of people, significantly more than half of Canadians say that they feel unsympathetic towards Brexit. Now, I want to mention that we ended up asking this survey at a time which was maybe a low point for the Brexit project, because Boris Johnson had just become Prime Minister and had hit the same brick walls that Theresa May had hit. So possibly the image of Brexit internationally was worse, or wasn't worse at any time than late September 2019. But nevertheless, I think maybe you would find, if you ask the question now, some small changes, but I don't think they would be incredibly significant. So then the question is, what are the factors that influence Canadians' perception of Brexit? And remember, I showed you these categories of factors that Sarah Hobolt used in research on the European Union. So we tried to just ask questions that, obviously it's not exactly the same, but speak to sort of similar categories here. So demographic factors, factors of collective identity, party political factors, and policy attitudes. And rather than showing you here sort of regression results, I thought this might be a nice way to summarize them. So these are factors that in our analysis proved statistically significant. If it's plus, it means that the factor increases the likelihood of someone being favorably inclined towards Brexit, and if it's minus, it's the opposite. So you see, many of these are not particularly surprising. Male people are more favorably inclined towards Brexit than females, but if you have a university degree and if you come from Quebec, that has a negative effect. People, unsurprisingly, feel an affinity to the UK, are more likely to view Brexit with sympathy, while people who have an affinity with Europe, and we didn't mean Europe as being everything but the UK, but the whole European continent, were less likely to be favorable. In terms of political parties, perhaps unsurprising given the statements I showed you from the party leaders, Conservatives much more likely to be favorable than Liberals and NDP. And then a view of referendums also played a role. People who felt that referendums are a good way to decide contentious issues were, perhaps also unsurprising, more willing to support Brexit. Just to show you how these figures actually look like, to make this a little bit more concrete. So in terms of male and female, it seems that more females were unsure in particular. You see the unsympathetic figures are very comparable, but significantly more men in favor of Brexit than women. University degree has a very strong effect. Regional differences, Quebec and prairies, which I calculated here as one group on sort of opposite sides of the scale, with significantly less sympathy for Brexit here in Quebec. Further figures are focusing on the other types of variables: identity, party, and policy attitudes. So affinity to Europe makes a clear difference. And then this is the most striking and are the clearest figures, the clearest differences anywhere in this research. Compare only 8.4% of people who usually vote the NDP saying that they were sympathetic to Brexit, as opposed to 46.6% of Conservatives. So we see it's a strongly partisan issue in Canada. The other factors are listed here, but perhaps also not particularly surprising. The next question that we asked was, what are your priorities for post-Brexit relations? And we forced people here to make a choice by saying, if Canada had to choose, what should be Canada's priority: relations to the European Union or relations to the United Kingdom. And we asked this, as you see here, for 4 areas of policy making: trade and investment, security and defense, environment and climate change, and energy. You see that the numbers, precise numbers, differ, but that for all of them, majorities said relations to the EU should be prioritized, which is quite a change in sort of historical perspective from Canada, obviously being a former member of the British Empire. And then we tried to cluster these responses and to see, well, do people who say preference for trade and investment is the EU, do they also say the preference for security and defense should also be the EU? So how did sort of people respond, and how did people's responses in these various 4 policy categories relate to each other? So this results in 4 clusters. The largest, almost half of people, which we call the Eurosphere cluster, said for all of the 4 policy areas, Canada should prioritize relations with the European Union. Much fewer people, only 8%, saying that in all 4 policy areas, Canada should prioritize relations with the United Kingdom. Then there was one other significant cluster, which we call EU with UK security. So they said that Canada should prioritize relationships with the EU in all fields but security and defense. And then the last group is sort of a mixed group of people who had all different other kinds of combinations that they would prefer. And again, you can then see how these clusters break down and what explains the popularity of these clusters. And here's another attempt to do that for each of the individual clusters. So Eurosphere tend to be people who are more likely, people who are young, have a university degree, less from the Maritimes or from the prairies, tend not to have an affinity to the UK. Being an NDP supporter helps. Having a positive view of the EU does, of course, that's not surprising. And not having sympathy for Brexit. For the Anglosphere, strong, very strong influence. I will show you that in a moment, of gender. Quebec, unsurprisingly, doesn't like that so much. Liberals don't like that so much. And then EU with UK security. Here, income, interestingly, shows significance. This is particularly likely to occur in Ontario, and people who say that common values are at the core of transatlantic relations also are significantly more likely to choose this type of cluster of attitudes. So I'll show you again some figures here, and those will be my last 2 or 3 slides. So here's the gender effect that I pointed out. Now, 11.9% of male respondents saying that Canada should, in all fields, prioritize relations with the United Kingdom, and only 3% of women saying that. Educational effects, the role of Ontario here in EU with UK security. Common values playing a role. People who say that the transatlantic relationship is defined by common values, they tend to be more likely to prefer this combination of cooperating with the EU on trade, environment, energy, but with the UK on security and defense. And again, we have huge political party effects in the popularity of these various models here. And we also have very significant effects of these variables: sympathy for Brexit, positive or negative view of the EU. I mentioned this. It might be unsurprising. Of course, if you view the EU positively, you are more likely to think that Canada should cooperate with it. But these are also factors that are potentially volatile. So this, to me, suggests that there could be a bit of volatility in this data. And as, for instance, if Brexit becomes more of a success than people think, that might also affect these perceptions, because there is a significant, strong effect of these sort of more short-term perceptions here. So where does all of this leave us? So some conclusions. First of all, I hope to have showed that, in my view, Brexit poses important challenges for Canadian foreign policy in these two dimensions, policy and identity. And we need to take that more seriously than sort of using Brexit as a wedge issue where you can sort of slam your political opponent with. These are very real challenges that all Canadian political parties and all citizens should take really seriously. In policy terms, I think the reconfiguration of economic relations is the most immediate challenge, and the main difficulty here is that we are negotiating, Canada is negotiating with the United Kingdom in a situation where the broader context of UK trade policy and the other deals that the UK wants to make or will make are totally unclear. In identity terms, there is, I think, potential for more internal divisions in Canada about Canada's global identity that Brexit triggers. And we saw here that this is discussed in strongly partisan terms. If you really want to simplify, conservatives are the outliers who view these issues quite differently than supporters of most of the other parties. In my perspective, the key desideratum, the key concern for policy should be to try to not be pushed into a political issue where Canada will, or into a political situation where Canada will need to choose, or where there's even the perception that Canada will have to choose between relations with the EU and with the United Kingdom. Because that would first of all be bad policy. It's clearly in Canada's policy interest to have good relations with both, but it could also be internally extremely dividing because of these significant partisan differences here. So Canadian policy must try to avoid being put as far as they can into that position and emphasize how important it is and how achievable it should be to have good relations with both partners post-Brexit, both the European Union with then 27 member states and the United Kingdom, which then has left the European Union. I leave it at that and look forward to your questions.
Hello, my name is Martina. I'm a student at political science here. So aside from the historic hostility to the United Kingdom, I found it shocking that Quebec did not feel sympathetic for the UK because they themselves struggled for sovereignty, national identity, and control over their own area and values over a central force. So was there any insight why Quebec was not sympathetic as opposed to understanding the struggle, especially with referendums?
Okay. Well, I didn't really find this that surprising myself because obviously Quebec emphasizes much more the French tradition in Canada and often sees that as being opposed to the British tradition, and Quebec is very concerned of the British tradition being overwhelming and sort of pushing out the French. So from that perspective, I think it's not particularly surprising that the sympathies in Quebec would be more likely to be with France, and as France remains in the European Union with the European Union and against Brexit.
So you're, sorry, just to clarify, so you believe that the historical history between Quebec and the United Kingdom trumps the relationship in like modern political discourse that they've had with the relationship in Canada?
I think it's mainly, it's perceived through a domestic Canadian lens, where obviously the alignment is much more, or the emphasis of Quebec is much more to protect the French against the English.
Thank you.
All right. I think I would also ask some of you who are sitting in the middle to just come out or maybe line up to the microphone or in the front.
On this question though, while you are moving with the microphone.
I should be, yes.
I maybe did not point out one interesting figure here. Where are we? Political parties. If you look at the Bloc Québécois, so this is not Quebec, but Quebec separatists, what is interesting is that they are confused They are not sure. 34% are not sure what to think about Brexit because it sort of, my interpretation is that they are sort of conflicting objectives. On the one hand, they like the idea of separating, but they don't like the sort of the Anglo associations of Brexit. Yes.
Hi, I'm Pat McGinnis. I teach economics here. So, two questions. One is, if Brexit happens, or assume Brexit happens, and we're all going to need new trade deals, and we, Canadians, happen to live a little north of, a little bit more of a bully, and maybe they're going to get to the front of the line. Let's say that they do get to the front of the line. What does Canada and United Kingdom do in the meantime with respect to trade?
First of all, I wouldn't say if Brexit happens anymore. I think it's pretty clear that it will happen very, very soon. What will happen if no agreement is reached? I think the one thing that could sort of reassure us is that both the United Kingdom and Canada really want to have a trade agreement. It's in everyone's interest. So I'm pretty confident that even in the case of an agreement not being ready in time, there would be a willingness to think about interim measures, applying certain provisions from CETA on a temporary basis to bridge any potential gaps. This is challenging for Canada to negotiate, but the good thing is that I think there's a really strong interest on both sides to get this done. For the UK, because they need to show that we can do trade agreements, and if not with Canada, with whom? It would be much easier for the UK to do a deal with Canada than with the United States, for example. And for Canada, yes, because of the economic dependency, I think there's also strong interest here.
Okay, maybe you answered this question already given your original statement there, but the original Brexit vote was 52-48?
51.8, yeah.
Yeah. Now, would Brexit be the same thing if Jeremy Corbyn wasn't the leader of the Labour Party?
That's a hypothetical question. Obviously, he was not an effective campaigner for Remain, let's put it that way. And the Labour Party's official position was for Remain. So it might have played a role. I mean, an effective left-wing case for remaining in the United Kingdom might have convinced many Labour voters. The way it went, many Labour voters did actually support Brexit.
Hi, my name is Rob. Thanks for coming today. We really, really appreciate it. My question is actually on a very similar vein to the professor's, which is, as the United States, of course, has a stronger negotiating position, does it benefit Canada to utilize current trade agreements like NAFTA to continue negotiating with the EU, or is it something you think we'd be better off pursuing just on our own?
So with the EU, we don't have to negotiate because we have an agreement, the CETA agreement. With the UK, don't really see how NAFTA, or this new USMCA, would come in at this point. But obviously, I mean, there are some people who have sort of big visions down the road of an agreement, transatlantic agreement with Canada and the US and the UK. That could potentially happen, but I don't see this happening soon, particularly under this time pressure. So we will first see bilateral agreements. From the UK's perspective, the one with Canada should be simple. The one with the United States is much more challenging. It's a much bigger prize, but the United States, as you said, is also much more of a bully in trade negotiations, and they have already indicated that they want certain product standards to be lowered and so on. This, in turn, would be something that the EU doesn't like to see in its future trade negotiations. So you can see the enormous challenge of UK trade negotiators as they are trying to sort of combine all of these different negotiations at the same time. And it's very difficult to predict. My prediction, though, would be that Canada that they would probably be interested in dealing with Canada sort of quickly and mobilizing their negotiators for the more tricky issues, which could be good for Canada. Yes?
Thank you. So my name is Parvin. I'm a political science student here. My question is more concerning the more, I guess, social or I guess, societal grievances that were raised with the Leave side with Brexit. I'm just wondering if you think the success of the Brexit referendum for the Leave side emboldens or creates a more legitimate foundation for either white nationalist governing groups or groups who are very anti-immigration, either internally within the EU or just more broadly speaking.
Yeah, I think that for the Leave campaign, the topic of migration was their biggest vote winner. I mean, there were others. There was this unhappiness with the EU and concerns about democracy and so on, but migration really mobilized the populist vote. And other populist parties have taken note of that and have shifted on to migration-focused campaigns. Even more so as the complexities of Brexit, which then became clear as the Brexit negotiations began, have shown to populist parties in other European states that leaving the EU is not necessarily their best campaign strategy. So actually what we see is that many populist parties in Western Europe at least have downgraded their anti-EU positions and focus even more exclusively on migration-related issues. So in that sense, yes, I think this is one of the lessons that they have drawn from Brexit.
Yes, okay, hi. So in regards to the trade relations, you said that a new agreement needs to be configured between Canada and the UK. Does this agreement have to be finalized before Brexit is finalized and they have separated? And if it doesn't, it comes after Brexit's completed, what is the agreement and terms of trade between Canada and the UK?
This is where this transition period comes in. So Brexit will happen in the sense of the UK leaving the European Union, will happen in 2 weeks, January 31st. But the transition period is until the end of this year. And while that transition period is running, the United Kingdom stays in the EU's customs union, which means it remains party to the EU's external trade agreements, including the CETA agreement. So therefore, that is the real deadline for Canada, the end of the transition period, December 31st, 2020. Many people in the EU, by the way, would have really liked to see the British to agree to extending the transition period to give more time for these negotiations, but Johnson, the British Prime Minister, has repeatedly ruled that out, and actually I think promised in the election campaign that that would not happen to appease his more hardline Brexit base. Personally, I don't think that's a very smart choice because he would probably be better off waiting a bit longer and negotiating better agreements so that Brexit becomes a success. But anyways, he wants to build this time pressure, and it seems to be pretty clear that there will be no extension of the transition period. So for Canada, that also means that December 31st of this year is the real deadline.
To follow up to that, in your opinion, do you think that because of this tight deadline, the quality of these agreements could be lessened and that it really is creating more pressure on countries to come up with agreements that might not be as comprehensive as they should be?
Yes.
So
So we've talked about negotiating strategies on the British side, but what about the European side? So if I was the Commission President, I would make these negotiations with the United Kingdom as hard as possible, maybe even a no-deal situation in order to dissuade any other European Union members from even thinking about leaving.
Well, that's certainly part of the EU's strategic calculus to say a non-member state cannot be better off than a member state. If you want to leave, then you need to give up something. So the EU's, as Commission President von der Leyen has said, the EU's preferred outcome is what, quote, no tariffs, no quotas, no dumping. The last element is interesting, no dumping. By that, she means that she wants alignment of product standards, social standards, environmental standards, and so on between the UK and the European Union, so that the UK cannot undercut by lower qualities, lower standards, the EU single market. If the UK does not agree to that, because some of the advocates of Brexit have said a big advantage of Brexit would be their ability to deregulate, if they want to do that, then the EU's position is they will also not get no tariffs and no quotas. So then we are moving into a situation where there will be more significant trade barriers imposed by the European Union on goods from the United Kingdom.
Hi. My question is more about the economics part of it. Do you think Canada would benefit more into since CETA was recently approved, to focus more on the member states of the European Union rather than the UK, or should we try to get the trade deal with the UK as soon as possible to keep the goods flowing?
Yeah, well, I think we definitely should try to get a deal with the UK, but, and that's actually one of the things that my colleague Patrick Leblanc in this project wants to focus on, is it might be that businesses are changing their strategies and they have thus far imported their goods to Europe through Britain. Maybe they will focus now on the Netherlands or use sort of other entry points into the single market. This is nothing that really the government in Canada obviously would control, but these would be business decisions. And I would expect to see, if you look at the economic figures, that we see more diversification, that some companies choose to use sort of other entry points into the single market. But nevertheless, it's definitely in Canada's interest to have a new trade agreement with the United Kingdom.
Hi, my name is Ruan, and I'm a political science student here. So I was just kind of curious about, I know that these are kind of like, you have to compile some data to come up with these numbers and everything. I'm very curious about the rural-urban split, if you noticed something about that in Canada, because I know that it was a key component in Brexit, that urban populations were more favorable towards remain, rural were more favorable towards leave. Did you see the same thing happening in Canada?
Unfortunately, that wasn't one of the variables we had in our survey. I should have talked to you earlier and we would have included it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Daniel, and I'm a political science student here at MacEwan. My question is that in the event that Brexit does happen, what would happen to the Scottish and Northern Irish people that wanted to remain? Like, would they try to start their own little version of Brexit to go back to the EU, or is that even possible?
Well, first of all, again, it's not in the event anymore. Brexit will happen. What will that mean to Scotland and Northern Ireland? That's a good question, because as my very first slide showed, that these were areas where there was a majority for Remain, pretty clear in Scotland, a little less clear in Northern Ireland. And in Scotland, indeed, the devolved government in Scotland is controlled by the Scottish Nationalist Party, which is pro-independence, and which is trying to sort of make the case for another independence referendum after they just not too long ago lost one in, I think, 2014. And I would for now, Boris Johnson has turned that request down and said he doesn't want to have another referendum. But I would expect if there is sustained pressure, particularly if there are any real grievances that people get upset about, if there's actually a tangible negative effect of Brexit that will be felt in Scotland, either economically or in terms of identity and so on, then at some point there will probably be another Scottish referendum. Northern Ireland is a different story because of the complications, obviously, of the peace process there. And I think the best we can hope for Northern Ireland is that the devolved administration, which has just taken up office again, does actually function and work, and the arrangement for the Irish border works so that no conflict is reignited there. I wouldn't want to speculate or even sort of demand or think about referendums there, because that would be extremely divisive in the Northern Irish context, and I haven't seen anyone really calling for that either.
Hi, my name is Evan, and I'm also a political science student at MacEwan. And given that the next federal election is a few years away, and by then the agreements are more or less probably going to be sorted out, or at least in the process of being sorted out, do you think that a more pro-EU or pro-UK stance would become more of a divisive issue in Canada and be more of like a priority for foreign policy platforms in the next election?
It could be, and that, as you point out, that depends when that election will be, and because it's a minority parliament, we don't really know. It depends on the next Conservative leader to a significant extent. So Scheer has been very pro-Brexit in his statements. You saw in the figures that his party is split, 46% pro, 42% unsympathetic towards Brexit. So will the next Conservative leader again emphasize this issue so heavily or not? So those are a couple of things that we can't really expect. Plus, the question is also, will there be political developments that put this issue on the agenda as a divisive issue, where Canada perceives or actually has to choose between relations to the EU and the UK? If that's the case, there's clearly the potential for politicization here in these figures. My hope would be, because I don't think that would be very productive, that can be avoided, but that will not be entirely under Canada's control, because it could also depend, for instance, on Donald Trump's trade strategies and that election in the US and so on.
All right, so let's thank Dr. Hurrelmann for his wonderful presentation.